He was the ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate, driving his new diamond-clad fiancée back to his sprawling mansion. But the world stopped when his headlights hit a heavy-set woman pulling a rusted scrap cart through the freezing rain. Trailing behind her, 2 shivering 5-year-olds with his exact grey eyes. Lorenzo Moretti owned the city of Chicago. At 34, he had solidified his family's empire, absorbing rival territories with a cold, calculating precision that left the streets whispering his name in hushed, terrified tones. He was returning from a 6-month stint in Palermo, having secured shipping routes that would make him practically untouchable. Beside him in the cavernous back seat of his custom Maybach sat Isabella Rossi, the daughter of the New York Commission's underboss. Isabella was everything a Mafia kingpin's wife was supposed to be, terrifyingly thin, draped in vintage Chanel, and utterly ruthless. She held a flute of champagne, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the crystal. "I don't understand why Tommy had to take us through this god-forsaken neighborhood. Renzo." Isabella complained, her gaze sweeping over the rain-slicked, pothole-ridden streets of the South Side. "It smells like wet garbage and despair out there. The Dan Ryan is shut down from a multi-car pile-up, Bella." Lorenzo replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that brokered no argument. He stared out the tinted window, nursing a glass of scotch. He hated this part of the city. It reminded him of things he had spent 5 years trying to bury. 5 years ago, Lorenzo had been a different man. He had been madly in love with a civilian, Beatrice Gallagher. Bea had been a bright-eyed, slender art restorer, with a laugh that could cut through the suffocating darkness of Lorenzo's world. They had married in secret. But his father, Carmine Moretti, had despised her. When Lorenzo was away on business, a devastating betrayal unfolded. Carmine presented Lorenzo with irrefutable proof that Beatrice had been funneling family secrets to the feds, and worse, that she had emptied offshore accounts to run away with a low-level enforcer. Broken and enraged, Lorenzo had torn the city apart, looking for her not to win her back, but to enact vengeance. But Beatrice had vanished without a trace. Eventually the ice closed over Lorenzo's heart. He became the monster his father always wanted him to be. The Maybach rolled slowly down a decaying stretch of industrial road, the heavy November rain turning the night into a blurred, freezing nightmare. "Look at these rats," Isabella sneered, pointing a diamond-ringed finger toward the sidewalk. Lorenzo glanced over indifferently, but his eyes locked onto a scene illuminated by the harsh glare of a flickering streetlight. A woman was struggling against the icy wind, her boots slipping on the wet pavement. She was dragging a heavy rusted metal cart, piled high with scrap iron, discarded copper wire, and crushed aluminum cans. She was heavily overweight, her body enveloped in a stained men's oversized parka that barely zipped over her wide hips. Her face was swollen with cold and exhaustion, a stark contrast to the hollowed-out look of the typical junkies that roamed these streets. She looked like a woman who had been beaten down by life, surviving on cheap carbohydrates and sheer animalistic willpower. Lorenzo was about to look away when a gust of wind blew the heavy wet hood back from her head. His breath hitched in his throat. The Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the plush Persian rug of the Maybach and shattering. "Lorenzo, what is wrong with you? You ruined my shoes!" Isabella shrieked, pulling her legs back. Lorenzo didn't hear her. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Beneath the heavy layers of fat, beneath the exhaustion and the dirt and the despair, he recognized the sharp slope of her nose. He recognized the way she desperately pushed a soaked strand of auburn hair behind her ear. He recognized the small, faded silver locket clutched tightly at her throat. It was Beatrice. His mind violently rejected the image. The Beatrice he knew was a delicate size 4, wearing silk slip dresses, and smelling of jasmine. The woman outside was easily double that size, lumbering and heavy, her hands raw and calloused as she strained against the straps of the scrap cart. But then the shadows behind the cart moved. Lorenzo pressed his face against the cold glass. Two small figures, bundled in ill-fitting threadbare coats, stepped into the light. A boy and a girl. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The little boy was pushing the back of the heavy cart with his tiny, freezing hands, trying to help his mother, while the little girl clung tightly to the hem of Beatrice's soaked coat. As the Maybach's headlights swept over them, the little boy squinted into the glare. Lorenzo stopped breathing entirely. The boy had pale, icy grey eyes. Moretti eyes. The exact same eyes that stared back at Lorenzo in the mirror every morning. The girl had the same sharp, aristocratic jawline that defined Lorenzo's bloodline. Tommy. Lorenzo choked out his voice, suddenly sounding like tearing metal. Stop the car. Now. Boss, we're not in a secure. I said stop the fucking car. Lorenzo roared, the sheer violence in his voice, making both Tommy and Isabella jump. The Maybach screeched to a halt, the heavy tires throwing up a wave of dirty puddle water that splashed against the sidewalk, barely missing Beatrice and the children. Lorenzo, what on earth are you doing? Isabella demanded, as Lorenzo threw open the heavy armored door. You cannot get out here. You're wearing a Brioni suit. Lorenzo ignored her, stepping out into the freezing, relentless downpour. The cold immediately bit through his tailored clothes, but he felt nothing. His eyes were fixed on the woman on the sidewalk. Beatrice had frozen when the luxury vehicle stopped. Panic, raw and terrifying, seized her wide face. She immediately let go of the cart's harness and shoved the two children behind her broad back, trying to shield them from view with her sheer mass. Keep your heads down, Leomia. Don't look at them, Beatrice whispered frantically, her voice raspy and terrified. She assumed it was a gang, or worse, someone coming to rob her of the $20 worth of scrap she had spent 14 hours collecting. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, splashing through the puddles. Beatrice looked up, ready to fight, ready to throw her heavy body at whoever was coming to protect her babies. Through the veil of freezing rain, the man stopped a few feet away. The street lamp cast harsh shadows over his sharp, tailored features. Beatrice's heart simply stopped. Beer, Lorenzo whispered. The word tasted like ash on his tongue. She staggered back, her heavy boots slipping on a piece of wet trash. If the cart hadn't been behind her, she would have fallen. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking almost ghostly beneath the grime. No! She breathed out, terror radiating from her every pore. No, no, no! Lorenzo stepped closer, his eyes raking over her. The shock of her physical transformation was jarring, entirely disorienting. She was fat. There was no other word for it. The stress, the poverty, the cheap dollar store pasta, that was all she could afford, had reshaped her entirely. But as his gaze moved from her wide frame down to the two children peeking out from behind her legs, the horror of her appearance was replaced by a localized nuclear rage. "They're mine," Lorenzo stated. It wasn't a question. The timeline was perfect. 5 years. Beatrice instinctively pushed the children further behind her thick legs. "Don't you look at them! Don't you dare look at them!" she hissed, her maternal instinct overpowering her terror. "You kept my children from me." Lorenzo's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a deadly quiet fury. "You stole my money, you ran off like a coward, and you forced my heirs to live in the gutters like rats." Beatrice let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Stole your money, ran off." She stepped forward, the heavy flesh of her face tight with a sudden vicious anger. "Is that what Carmine told you before he sent his men to put a bullet in my pregnant stomach?" Lorenzo froze. The rain battered against his shoulders. What? Your father. Beatrice screamed over the sound of the rain tears finally mixing with the freezing water on her cheeks. The night you left for Vegas, your father's men dragged me out of our bed. They told me I was a filthy civilian who was going to ruin the Moretti bloodline. He knew I was pregnant. He told me if I didn't disappear, he would cut the babies out of me and leave me to bleed out in the Chicago River. Lorenzo felt the earth tilt beneath him. My father. He showed me the bank transfers. He showed me the surveillance of you with Marco. Marco was the one who was supposed to kill me. Beatrice cried, her chest heaving heavily. He took pity on me. He took the money your father paid him, dumped me in a motel in Gary, Indiana, and told me to get fat, get ugly, and never show my face again if I wanted my children to live. So I did. She hit her own chest, a heavy, solid thud. Look at me, Lorenzo. Look at what I became to hide from your family. I ate garbage. I destroyed my body. I made myself invisible, so your father's soldiers wouldn't recognize the trophy wife you used to parade around. I pulled scrap metal through the snow so your children could eat. Lorenzo stared at her, the pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle violently clicking into place. Carmine had orchestrated the entire thing. His father had robbed him of his wife and forced his children into absolute degrading poverty. The guilt hit Lorenzo like a physical blow to the stomach. He looked at Beatrice's heavy, exhausted body, not with disgust, but with a sudden, crushing realization of her ultimate sacrifice. Her weight wasn't a sign of laziness. It was armor. It was camouflage. It was the physical manifestation of a mother's desperate will to keep her children alive. "Mummy, I'm cold." The little boy, Leo, whimpered, his teeth chattering, as he tugged on Beatrice's soaked coat. Lorenzo took a step toward his son, his hand trembling as he reached out. "Don't touch him," Beatrice snarled, swatting Lorenzo's hand away with surprising strength. "Lorenzo, for the love of God," a sharp, irritated voice rang out. Isabella had stepped out of the Maybach, an expensive silk umbrella held over her head by Tommy. She looked at the scene with unvarnished disgust, her eyes scanning Beatrice's wide, soaked figure and the rusted cart of garbage. "What are you doing talking to this homeless whale?" Isabella sneered, wrinkling her perfect surgically enhanced nose. "Give her $100 bill and let's go. I'm freezing." Beatrice's jaw tightened. She looked from the glamorous, rail-thin Isabella back to Lorenzo, a bitter resignation settling in her eyes. "You heard your fiancé, boss? We're just trash on the street. Let us get back to it." She turned, grabbing the heavy frayed ropes of the scrap cart, bracing her thick shoulders against the weight. "Come on, Leo. Mia, keep walking." Isabella laughed softly. "Honestly, Renzo, the charity cases you find." Lorenzo didn't look at Isabella. His eyes were locked on the rusted wheels of the scrap cart, struggling to turn in the mud, and the 2 tiny children trudging through the freezing rain beside a mother who had sacrificed her entire identity to keep them breathing. A dark, terrifying shadow crossed Lorenzo's face. The Mafia boss who had ruled Chicago with cold indifference was gone, replaced by a father who had just realized his kingdom was built on the bones of his own family. He slowly turned to Isabella. "Tommy," Lorenzo said, his voice eerily calm, devoid of all emotion. "Yeah, boss. Put Isabella back in the car. Take her to the airport. Her engagement is over." Isabella's jaw dropped, her perfectly glossed lips trembling in pure outrage. "Excuse me. You are leaving me?" The daughter of the New York underboss on a wet Chicago sidewalk for a fat, homeless bag lady. Lorenzo turned his head slowly. The look in his icy grey eyes was so deeply unhinged, so devoid of human mercy, that Isabella physically took a step back, nearly snapping the heel of her Louboutins. "Tommy," Lorenzo repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "If she speaks another word to my wife, leave her on the curb and drive away. Tommy, recognizing the lethal shift in his boss, grabbed Isabella firmly by the elbow, ignoring her indignantly hissed threats, and shoved her into the back of the Maybach. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off her screeching. Lorenzo turned back to Beatrice. She was shivering violently, her broad shoulders hunched against the biting November wind, still instinctively blocking the twins from his view. She gripped the rusted handle of the scrap cart with white-knuckled, calloused hands. "Be," Lorenzo said, stripping off his custom Brioni suit jacket. He stepped forward, ignoring the grime and mud, and draped the expensive wool over her soaked, oversized parka. "You're freezing. The kids are turning blue." "Don't," Beatrice whispered, a tear cutting through the soot on her cheek. She tried to shrug off the jacket, deeply ashamed of how her massive frame stretched the expensive fabric. "Lorenzo, please. If Carmine finds out, Carmine is a dead man walking." Lorenzo stated the vow, echoing like a gunshot in the empty street. "He just doesn't know it yet. But right now my son is coughing, and my daughter is shivering. You are getting off this street." He didn't wait for her to argue. Lorenzo pulled a sleek, encrypted burner phone from his pocket. Within 3 minutes, a heavily armored, matte-black Cadillac Escalade roared down the slick pavement, driven by his most loyal captain, a massive, quiet man named Donovan. "Leave the cart, Bea," Lorenzo ordered, gently reaching down to scoop up the little girl Mia. The child stiffened, terrified, but Lorenzo cradled her against his chest, shielding her from the rain. "I've got you, Piccola. You're safe now." Beatrice stared at the rusted cart, her lifeline for the past 5 years, the heavy burden that had broken her back but kept her children fed. With a trembling sigh, she let the handle drop. It clattered against the asphalt. She took Leo's small hand, her heavy legs aching as she climbed into the heated leather sanctuary of the Escalade. They didn't go to the Moretti family compound in Lake Forest. Lorenzo knew the estate was crawling with his father's loyalists. Instead, Donovan drove them to a secret off-the-books penthouse overlooking the Chicago River at the Trump International Hotel and Tower, a property Lorenzo owned through 3 dummy corporations. Once inside the sprawling, marble-floored penthouse, the stark contrast between Beatrice's reality and Lorenzo's world was blinding. Under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers, Beatrice felt entirely exposed. She stood awkwardly by the door, dripping dirty rainwater onto the imported Turkish rugs, wrapping her thick arms around her wide stomach in a defensive posture. Lorenzo directed Donovan to secure the perimeter and order clothes, medical supplies, and enough hot food to feed a small army. Then he turned to his family. "The bathrooms are down the hall. Heated floors, hot water," Lorenzo said softly, keeping his distance to avoid spooking the children. "Take them. Get warm." An hour later, the twins were scrubbed clean, dressed in oversized hotel robes, and aggressively devouring plates of hot rigatoni and buttered bread in the massive kitchen. Lorenzo watched them from the doorway, a heavy lump in his throat. Leo had his exact scowl when he concentrated on cutting his bread. Mia had Beatrice's gentle, observant eyes. Beatrice emerged from the master suite. She was wearing one of Lorenzo's black silk dress shirts and a pair of his sweatpants. The clothes fit her, highlighting the sheer mass she had put on over the years. Her wet auburn hair was combed back, revealing a face that was rounder-lined with exhaustion and completely stripped of the delicate glamour she had possessed at 22. She stood across the kitchen island, refusing to meet his gaze. "I know I'm disgusting to look at," Beatrice mumbled, her voice thick with shame. "You don't have to pretend. I know what you like. I saw the stick insect you were engaged to." Lorenzo moved around the marble island. He didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between them, reached out and gently took her scarred, calloused hands in his. "Look at me, Bea." he commanded, his voice thick with emotion. She squeezed her eyes shut, fat tears rolling down her swollen cheeks. "Look at me," he repeated, softer this time. When she finally opened her eyes, she didn't find pity or disgust in his gaze. She found absolute, shattering reverence. "You think I care about the weight?" Lorenzo whispered, raising her roughened hands to his lips and kissing her scarred knuckles. "You ate garbage. You destroyed your health. You wore heavy men's clothes to hide your shape. You turned yourself into a ghost so that my father's monsters wouldn't see the beautiful woman I married." He reached up his thumbs, wiping the tears from her wide cheeks. "Every pound you carry is a shield that kept my children alive. You are the most terrifyingly strong woman I have ever known. I don't see a flaw, Beatrice. I see a mother who went to war for her family. I see my queen." Beatrice broke. A heartbreaking, guttural sob ripped from her throat, and she collapsed against his chest. Lorenzo wrapped his arms around her wide frame, burying his face in her damp hair, holding her together as 5 years of suppressed terror. Starvation and isolation poured out of her. But the tender reunion was violently cut short. Lorenzo's phone vibrated on the marble counter. It was Tommy. "Boss." Tommy's voice crackled, laced with panic. Isabella called her father the second she got to O'Hare. The New York Commission is livid, but worse. She called Carmine. She told him you dumped her for some heavy-set, homeless woman with twin kids. Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. "Carmine knows, boss." Tommy rushed out. He checked the timeline. He knows Beatrice is alive and the kids are yours. He just dispatched a heavily armed cleanup crew to the city. They're pinging your burner phone. Lorenzo hung up. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. The glass wasn't bulletproof. "Donovan," Lorenzo roared, pulling a matte black Glock 19 from the small of his back. "Arm up. We have visitors." The heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open before Donovan could even engage the secondary deadbolts. Carmine Moretti didn't employ subtle men. He employed butchers. 4 men in dark tactical gear flooded the entryway, suppressed submachine guns raised. "Get the kids down," Lorenzo shouted, diving behind the thick marble kitchen island as a hail of bullets shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows. Glass rained down like diamond dust, the freezing night air howling into the luxury suite. Beatrice didn't freeze. 5 years on the streets had beaten the civilian hesitation out of her. She grabbed Leo and Mia, shoving them viciously under the heavy reinforced steel frame of the Viking industrial stove. "Do not move. Do not make a sound," she hissed, her maternal instinct transforming her into something primal. Donovan returned fire from the hallway, his heavy shotgun roaring, sending the lead attacker flying backward into the corridor. Lorenzo popped up from behind the island, his aim cold and mechanical, placing 2 rounds in the chest of the second hitman. But there were too many. A third man, a towering enforcer named Russo, whom Lorenzo recognized from his father's inner circle, flanked the kitchen. He bypassed Lorenzo, his cold eyes locking onto the cowering children under the stove. "Carmine says loose ends get tied," Russo grunted, raising his weapon toward the twins. He never got the chance to pull the trigger. Beatrice, driven by a raw, explosive fury, lunged from the shadows. She didn't have a weapon, but she had leverage, and she had mass. With a terrifying scream, the heavy-set mother threw her entire body weight directly at the enforcer's knees. The impact was devastating. Over 250 pounds of desperate, enraged mother slammed into Russo's legs. The bone in his right knee snapped with a sickening crack. Russo roared in agony, his weapon firing wildly into the ceiling as he crashed to the floor. Before he could recover, Beatrice scrambled onto his chest. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stovetop and brought it down on his skull with earth-shattering force. Once, twice. The enforcer went limp. Lorenzo dropped the final hitman by the door and spun around his heart in his throat. He found his wife kneeling over a bleeding assassin, panting heavily, her chest heaving, the iron skillet still gripped tightly in her hand. She looked up at Lorenzo, her eyes wild, daring anyone else to come near her babies. "Are they hurt?" Lorenzo demanded, rushing to the stove. "They're fine." Beatrice gasped, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to recede. Lorenzo looked at the blood pooling on his expensive rugs. The message was clear. Carmine would never stop. There was no hiding, no negotiating. In the Mafia, a reigning king who ordered a hit on his own bloodline had to be completely eradicated. "Donovan," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a terrifying dead calm. "Call the captains, call the capos, every single man loyal to me." "What's the order, boss?" Donovan asked, reloading his shotgun, his face grim. "We are going to Lake Forest," Lorenzo replied, checking the magazine of his Glock. "My father's reign ends tonight." The storm outside was nothing compared to the violence that descended upon the Moretti estate. Lorenzo didn't sneak in. He kicked the front doors off their hinges, backed by 30 heavily armed men who were fiercely loyal to the young boss over the aging paranoid patriarch. The compound fell in less than 20 minutes. Carmine's guards, seeing the writing on the wall, laid down their weapons and stepped aside. Lorenzo found his father in his sprawling mahogany study, sitting behind a massive desk, nursing a glass of scotch. Carmine looked old, his face pale, as Lorenzo stalked into the room, his clothes stained with rain and blood. "You broke an alliance with New York for a fat street-walking pig." Carmine spat, attempting to maintain his authority, though his hands shook. "You are weak, Lorenzo. You think with your heart. She will ruin this family." "She is this family," Lorenzo said coldly. "She sacrificed her body, her dignity, and her life to protect my heirs from a monster. She is 10 times the boss you could ever pretend to be." Lorenzo didn't monologue. He didn't offer a chance for redemption. He simply raised his weapon. "You ordered the murder of my pregnant wife." Lorenzo stated, the ice in his eyes absolute. "You forced my children to eat out of garbage cans. You are no father of mine." 2 suppressed shots echoed through the study. The reign of Carmine Moretti was over. 1 year later, the sprawling gardens of the Moretti estate were bathed in warm, golden autumn sunlight. The heavily guarded walls kept the chaos of the Chicago syndicate at bay, creating a perfect, untouchable sanctuary. Lorenzo sat on a stone bench, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching his children run across the manicured lawns. Leo and Mia were thriving, their cheeks full and rosy, their laughter echoing through the trees, a stark contrast to the shivering, terrified ghosts he had found on the south side a year ago. The heavy glass doors of the patio opened, and Beatrice stepped out. She hadn't magically lost the weight. The trauma of starvation and the protective layers she had built didn't just melt away. She was still a plus-sized woman, but the exhaustion and terror were gone from her face. She was dressed in a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green dress that hugged her wide curves beautifully, her auburn hair styled in soft waves. She wore the wealth and power of the Moretti family, not with arrogance, but with a grounded, unshakable confidence. Lorenzo stood up, his eyes darkening with raw affection as she approached. He wrapped his arms around her thick waist, pulling her flush against him. "The New York Commission sent their tribute," Lorenzo murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Isabella's father wants to assure us there is no bad blood." Beatrice chuckled, a rich, warm sound. "Tell him I expect double the tribute next month. A mother's peace of mind is expensive." Lorenzo smiled, leaning down to capture her lips in a deep, possessing kiss. He didn't care about the whispers of the other Mafia wives or the superficial standards of the underworld. He had the strongest woman in Chicago standing by his side, a queen who had walked through hell, carried the weight of the world, and pulled a cart through the freezing rain to keep their kingdom alive. And he would burn down the rest of the world before he ever let her go again. And that is how a mother's sacrifice brought a ruthless boss to his knees and rewrote the Chicago underworld. Beatrice proved true strength is about the absolute lengths you will go to protect your family. Did you love this intense story of betrayal, survival, and ultimate Mafia revenge? Hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling audio dramas. Tell us what you thought about Beatrice's incredible journey today.